The Hells Angels biker saw the little girl brush sand off a buried box, and its contents should never have seen daylight. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a bright afternoon in the small coastal town of Huntington Beach, a Hells Angels biker named Jake was taking a break from his long ride. The salty ocean breeze felt good as he stood by his bike, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore soothing his nerves. He had just finished a meeting with his brothers and was planning to head back to his hideout when something caught his eye. A small figure appeared ahead, a little girl, no older than 8, kneeling by the sand. She was brushing away at something buried beneath the surface. Intrigued, Jake approached cautiously, his boots sinking into the soft sand. As he got closer, he could see the little girl was focused on something, her tiny hands moving quickly as if she had discovered something important. Her brown hair swayed in the wind as she worked, the sun casting a warm glow on her innocent face. The bike engine was idling behind him, but Jake couldn't tear his gaze away from the girl. The girl blinked and shrugged. I'm not sure. It just looked like a box. But it feels like there's something inside. With a careful hand, Jake helped her lift the lid, and what they found inside made his heart stop. It wasn't gold or jewelry as he had expected. Instead, it was a collection of old, faded photographs and a small, cracked piece of paper with scribbled writing on it. The paper was barely legible, but Jake could make out one word that sent a chill down his spine. Danger. The photographs were of people Jake didn't recognize, but the feeling in his gut told him that whoever they were, their stories were buried deep, locked away for a reason. The girl, still holding the box, looked up at Jake. Is it dangerous? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake hesitated. He had no idea, but something told him that this discovery was more than just an innocent find. The box had been buried for a reason, and whatever was inside it had been meant to stay hidden. I think we need to find out, he said slowly, closing the box and glancing around. His instincts were telling him that someone, or something, was watching. But who? And why had this box been buried here? There was only one way to find out, and Jake was determined to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, Jake made up his mind. He couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. He was about to step into a world of secrets, and the little girl was now part of it, whether she knew it or not. But as he looked back at her, her eyes still locked on the box, Jake felt a sense of responsibility wash over him. This was no longer just about him. It was about protecting her, and uncovering a hidden past that should never have been revealed. Jake carefully tucked the box under his arm as the sun began to dip lower on the horizon, casting long shadows across the beach. The little girl, still staring at the mysterious contents of the box, looked up at him, her eyes wide with curiosity. She had no idea what she had uncovered, but something told Jake that the secrets inside that box were about to change everything. He glanced around, feeling the weight of the discovery settle into his chest. The beach, which had seemed so peaceful moments before, now felt like a trap. The breeze rustled through the palm trees, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. We need to get out of here, he muttered under his breath. The girl, sensing his urgency, nodded silently, and they quickly made their way back to the bike. The sound of the engine roaring to life echoed across the empty stretch of beach, cutting through the quiet like a warning. As they sped away, Jake's mind raced. He wasn't sure what the photographs meant, but he knew they were connected to something bigger. The scribbled word danger on the note made it clear. They weren't the only ones interested in the box. He had to protect the little girl, but he also needed to figure out what had been hidden for so long. The bike's engine hummed steadily beneath him as they drove through the winding roads, the sound almost soothing compared to the turmoil in his mind. But the peace was fleeting. His eyes scanned the rearview mirror as they rode, noticing a black sedan tailing them from a distance. We're being followed, Jake muttered, his voice tight. The girl, still holding the box tightly in her hands, looked up at him, confusion written all over her face. Are we in trouble? She asked quietly. Jake hesitated, his grip tightening on the handlebars. Maybe, but we'll be fine. He hoped he was right. They pulled off the main road and into a small wooded area, the bike's tires kicking up dust as they sped down a narrow path. Jake's heart raced, not just from the speed, but from the tension building inside him. He could feel the eyes of whoever was following them burning into his back. They had to get to safety. After what felt like an eternity, Jake led them to an old warehouse on the outskirts of town. The place was abandoned, but it had always been a good spot to lay low. The rusty metal doors creaked as he pushed them open, leading them into the shadowed interior. He parked the bike near the back, out of sight from the road, and turned to the little girl. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "I'm going to check the place out." She nodded, but Jake could see the worry in her eyes. He hated leaving her alone, but he couldn't risk someone finding them while he was distracted. He stepped outside, his boots crunching on the gravel as he made his way around the building. His instincts were on high alert. He had to know if they were still being followed. The sound of a car engine reached his ears, growing louder by the second. Jake ducked behind a stack of old crates, his heart pounding in his chest. The black sedan slowed as it approached the warehouse, coming to a stop just outside. The engine cut off, and for a long moment, there was silence. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the door to the sedan opened. He couldn't make out the figure that stepped out, but he knew it wasn't good news. The person moved with purpose, heading toward the back of the building. Jake's fingers tightened around the handle of his motorcycle. He had to get back inside. As he crept back toward the warehouse, the little girl was waiting by the door, her face pale and wide-eyed. "What's going on?" she whispered. "We're not safe," Jake replied, his voice low. He grabbed the box from her hands and quickly hid it in a safe spot. "I need you to stay quiet, okay?" The girl nodded, clinging to his side as he scanned the area. He could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate. They were getting closer. Jake's mind raced. He had to think fast. He couldn't let anyone else get their hands on that box, not when he had no idea what it contained. As the footsteps grew louder, Jake steeled himself for whatever was coming. He wasn't going to let them take the box. Not now. Not ever. The door to the warehouse creaked open, and Jake's heart stopped. The figure stepped inside, their face hidden in the shadows. Jake held his breath, every muscle in his body coiled tight. He had no idea what would happen next, but one thing was for sure. Their lives would never be the same again. Jake stood still, heart pounding as the figure stepped further into the warehouse, his boots scraping the concrete floor with an eerie echo. The air felt thick with tension. The dim light from the single overhead bulb cast long shadows, but Jake could see enough to make out the tall silhouette of a man who seemed too confident, too calm. The footsteps stopped. There was a moment of silence. Jake's mind raced. Whoever this person was, they had come here with a purpose. He held his breath and moved slowly, making sure to keep to the shadows as he observed the man. The figure didn't seem to notice him at first, distracted by the surroundings. Jake's fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of his leather jacket, the cold touch of his worn-out gloves a reminder that he was far from a safe place. His instincts, honed over years of life in the club, told him to move, to act first. But he knew he had to be careful. The last thing he needed was a confrontation that could jeopardize the little girl's safety. The man's voice cut through the silence, low and steady. "I know you're in here, Jake. Don't try to hide." Jake's heart skipped a beat. How did this person know him? Who was he? Jake stayed in place, unmoving, his breath shallow as he tried to stay out of sight. He couldn't let this stranger find the girl. The man's voice continued, now tinged with a dangerous amusement. "You've been running long enough, haven't you? But it's over now. I'm here to finish what's been started." Jake clenched his jaw. He wasn't going down without a fight. He knew the man wasn't just looking for trouble. This was personal. The weight of the situation pressed in on him like a vice. And it wasn't just the box that had drawn the man here. It was something deeper, something connected to his past that Jake hadn't been able to outrun. The man took a step forward, and Jake moved, silently as a shadow, toward the back of the warehouse. His mind raced as he thought of the little girl hiding in the corner. She was safe for now, but how much longer could that last? The man spoke again, his tone dark. "I don't know why you're trying to protect her, but you can't keep running, Jake. Your past is coming for you. And you're not going to be able to hide behind that leather jacket forever." Jake's pulse quickened. He had no choice now. He couldn't keep running. He had to confront this. He couldn't let the past swallow him whole. Stepping into the light, Jake faced the man, his fists clenched at his sides. Who the hell are you? He demanded, his voice low but forceful. The man's lips curled into a half-smile, his eyes glinting with a cold, calculating edge. I'm the one who's been waiting for you to slip up, Jake. I'm the one who knows what you've done. And now, I'm here to make you pay. The words hit Jake like a slap. It wasn't just some random enemy. This was someone from his past, someone who had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The pieces started to fall into place, but Jake still couldn't understand why this man was here. Why now? What did he want with the little girl? The man took a step closer, his shadow swallowing Jake's. You think you can walk away from the things you've done? You think you can hide from the club? Jake's grip tightened on his jacket. He wasn't going to let this man intimidate him, not now. I'm not hiding, Jake growled. I've made mistakes, but I'm not running anymore. The man chuckled darkly, shaking his head. That's what you always say, Jake. But you're running now, aren't you? You've been running ever since you joined the Hells Angels. Jake's eyes narrowed. He had no time for this. He needed answers. What do you want with the box? He asked, cutting to the heart of the matter. The man paused, his smile fading as he looked down at the ground. It's not just about the box, Jake, he said softly. It's about what's inside it. It's about what you've been keeping hidden. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew the man wasn't talking about the photographs or the piece of paper. This was something deeper, something more dangerous. You've been carrying that weight for too long. The man continued, his voice low and dangerous. And now, it's time to pay the price. Jake's heart raced. He had to stop this before it went any further. Before the man could take another step, Jake lunged, knocking him to the ground. The man let out a grunt of surprise, but Jake was already on top of him, pinning him to the floor. This ends now, Jake snarled. The man struggled beneath him, but Jake's grip tightened. He wasn't going to let anyone else get hurt. The little girl's life was at stake, and Jake wasn't going to let anyone destroy that. As the struggle continued, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and Jake froze. He heard footsteps approaching. More of them. More enemies. He had no idea how many were coming, but he knew one thing. This wasn't over. Jake froze as he heard the new set of footsteps approaching, each one heavier and more deliberate than the last. The man beneath him struggled, trying to push Jake off, but Jake's grip remained firm. He couldn't afford to let this go on any longer. The door to the warehouse creaked open wider, and Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He knew there was no way he could fight off more enemies and protect the little girl at the same time. He glanced quickly over at her, still hidden in the corner, clutching the box tightly to her chest. The fight wasn't just about him anymore. It was about her, about keeping her safe from whatever was coming. The first of the new arrivals entered the warehouse. Jake's eyes darted to the man's face, and his blood ran cold. It was someone he recognized, a face from his past, one that should have stayed buried. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a scar running down his cheek. His eyes locked with Jake's for a brief moment before a cold smile spread across his lips. Did you really think you could outrun this, Jake? The man said, his voice low and filled with menace. Jake's breath quickened. This wasn't just about the box anymore. This was personal. The man who had just entered the warehouse was part of a group that Jake had tried to escape for years. Men who knew the dark side of Jake's past. Men who had more power than he could ever imagine. The man's gaze shifted to the girl in the corner, and his grin widened. Well, what do we have here? He stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete floor. Jake stood up, shoving the man beneath him aside. He had to protect the girl, had to keep her out of the hands of these people. Stay back, Jake growled, his fists clenched. But the man only chuckled, as if Jake's warning was a joke. You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. The man sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. You're weak, Jake. You always have been. As the man advanced, Jake's mind raced. He wasn't about to let this guy get any closer to the girl. With a quick, practiced movement, Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light of the warehouse. The man stopped in his tracks, his smile faltering for just a moment before he spoke again. You really think that will stop me? He asked, his voice full of disbelief. But Jake wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when the girl was in danger. I don't need it to stop you, Jake said, his voice colder than ice. I just needed to slow you down. With that, he lunged, moving faster than the man had anticipated. The blade flashed in the air, narrowly missing the man's shoulder as he dodged back. Jake's eyes never left him. The man was bigger, stronger, but Jake had something the man didn't, desperation. And when it came to protecting someone, Jake had learned to use that desperation as fuel. The fight raged on. Jake was fast, relentless, but the man was trained, and each move was calculated. As they collided, Jake's thoughts flashed back to the time he had spent in the Hells Angels, to the things he had done to survive. There was no escaping the violence, no matter how hard he tried. But now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about making sure the girl didn't get caught in this nightmare. With a swift kick, Jake knocked the man off balance, sending him crashing into a stack of crates. He didn't waste a second. He turned toward the girl, his eyes scanning the room, looking for any sign of movement. She was still there, her wide eyes filled with fear. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice urgent. But as he took a step toward her, he heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. His head whipped around, and there, standing in the doorway, was another man. This one holding a pistol aimed directly at Jake. "Going somewhere?" the man asked, his voice cold and calculated. Jake's mind raced. There was no way out, no easy escape. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. But he wasn't going to let it end like this. He couldn't. The girl was depending on him. "You don't have to do this," Jake said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. The man with the gun sneered. "You think I care what you say? You're nothing but a rat, Jake. You always were." Jake took a step forward, his eyes locked on the barrel of the gun. He had no other choice. He couldn't run, couldn't hide. This was it. This was the moment that would define everything. And then, just as the man's finger began to tighten on the trigger, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. The man with the gun spun around, his eyes wide with shock. In that split second, Jake acted. He lunged forward, knocking the man to the ground, his fist connecting with the man's jaw. The gun skittered across the floor, and Jake grabbed it, turning toward the girl. But when he looked back, the man he had just knocked out was already getting back to his feet, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Jake's breath caught. He wasn't alone in this fight, and the stakes were higher than ever before. Jake's heart raced as the man he had just knocked down scrambled to his feet, his eyes wide with fury. The gun he had dropped was now within reach, and Jake knew this fight wasn't over yet. His fingers tightened around the cold steel of the weapon he had just taken. The man glared at him, a dangerous look in his eyes. He wasn't backing down, and neither was Jake. Jake's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of this mess. But the more he thought, the more trapped he felt. He couldn't leave the girl. Not now. Not when they were this close to the danger. He looked over at her. She was still by the corner, clutching the box to her chest. Her innocent eyes were wide with fear, but she hadn't moved. She was trusting him. That thought fueled his determination. The man took a step toward him, his fingers twitching toward the gun. "You're making a mistake, Jake," the man sneered, his voice low and full of venom. "You can't run from your past forever." Jake's grip on the gun tightened. He knew what this man meant. His past had been catching up with him for years, and now it was all coming to a head. The Hells Angels, the people he had wronged, the debts he hadn't paid, they were all here, standing in front of him, demanding answers. "I'm not running anymore," Jake said, his voice cold. "I'm done with this life." The man laughed, but it was a bitter, hollow sound. "You think you can just walk away? You can't leave. You never could." Jake's pulse quickened. He knew this man wasn't just talking about the past. He was talking about the present, the danger that was right in front of them, the people who were still hunting them. The man took another step, but Jake didn't flinch. He knew what he had to do. The little girl, the box, the photographs, they all had to be protected. "Get away from her," Jake warned, aiming the gun at the man's chest. The man smirked, unfazed. "You think that'll stop me?" But Jake was done talking. With a swift motion, he pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, loud and jarring in the confined space of the warehouse. The man jerked back, but he wasn't hit. He had moved just in time. But Jake wasn't finished. He fired again, this time hitting the man in the shoulder. The man collapsed to the floor with a loud grunt, his hand clutching his wound. "You're not getting away with this, Jake," the man spat, pain seeping into his voice. But Jake wasn't listening anymore. He turned toward the girl, his heart hammering in his chest. "We need to go," he said urgently, rushing to her side. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with confusion and fear. "But what about him?" she asked, glancing back at the man on the floor. Jake didn't answer right away. He didn't have time to explain. He couldn't risk the man getting up and trying to hurt her. "We'll deal with him later," Jake said, his voice firm. He grabbed the box from her hands and stuffed it into his jacket, motioning for her to follow him. The girl hesitated, but only for a second. She trusted him. She followed his lead without a word. Jake moved quickly, his eyes darting around the warehouse. He could feel the tension in the air, the sound of the man groaning in pain behind him, the distant rumble of approaching vehicles outside. They didn't have much time. "Come on," Jake urged, his voice low but commanding. He pushed, opened the back door of the warehouse, and stepped out into the cold night air. The girl was right behind him, still clutching the edges of her jacket to stay warm. As they ran toward the nearby alley, Jake's mind was racing. The man wasn't the only one after them. They had more enemies out there, and Jake knew they would stop at nothing to get what was in that box. The photographs, the notes, whatever it was dangerous. And he had to keep it safe. The alley was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of the street lamps down the block. Jake didn't stop running. His instincts told him they weren't safe yet, that they couldn't stop until they were far away from the warehouse. He glanced behind him to make sure the girl was still with him. She was, but she was starting to lag behind. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice urgent. He grabbed her hand and pulled her along faster. The sound of car engines grew louder, closer. Someone was coming. They couldn't outrun them forever. "Jake," the girl said, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." Jake's heart clenched at the sound of her fear. He didn't want to scare her, but he knew the danger they were in. "I know," he said softly, "but we're going to be okay. I promise." The words felt hollow even as he said them. He wasn't sure they would be okay, but he couldn't let her see that. He couldn't let her see how afraid he was. They rounded the corner of the alley and onto a street lined with empty shops. Jake could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, urging him forward. The sound of tires screeching to a stop reached his ears. They were here. Jake turned to the girl, his eyes narrowing with determination. "Run," he ordered, giving her a slight push toward a narrow gap between two buildings. She hesitated, but only for a second. She trusted him, and she knew he wasn't about to give up. Without another word, she ran. Jake took one last look behind him, his hand still clutching the gun. He couldn't protect her if they caught up, and he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not when they were so close to getting away. Jake's heart pounded as he followed the girl into the narrow gap between the buildings, the distant sound of tires screeching and engines revving echoing in his ears. He glanced back just in time to see the headlights of a car rounding the corner, its speed picking up as it closed in on their position. The girl was already several feet ahead of him, her legs moving faster than he thought possible. Her small frame was an advantage in these tight spaces, but Jake wasn't sure how long they could keep running. The car was getting closer. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as he picked up his pace, his boots pounding against the concrete. He had no choice but to push harder, to keep up with her. As they turned the corner into another alley, Jake felt a rush of relief. The car's headlights were no longer in sight, but he knew they weren't safe yet. He turned to the girl, who was breathing heavily, her face pale and wide-eyed. She looked scared, but determined. "Keep going," Jake urged, his voice firm. She nodded without question and kept running, her footsteps light and quick as she weaved through the alley. Jake stayed close, watching their backs. The last thing he wanted was to be caught off guard. They reached a dead-end street, the buildings towering on either side of them. The girl stopped, looking around frantically, unsure of which way to go. Jake scanned the area, his mind working fast. They had to keep moving. He wasn't sure how much time they had left before the people chasing them would catch up. "This way," Jake said, grabbing the girl's arm and pulling her toward an old rusted fire escape. He climbed up quickly, the girl following behind him. Her small hands grasped the cold metal rungs, her breath coming in short gasps as she struggled to keep up. Jake reached the top first, his legs aching from the sudden burst of speed. He turned to look down at her, offering his hand. "Come on," he urged. She hesitated for just a moment before taking his hand and pulling herself up onto the rooftop. As they reached the top, Jake's heart skipped a beat. He could see the distant glow of headlights again, this time much closer. They had to be running out of time. They didn't have a plan. They didn't have a way out. And yet, they were still running. "We can't keep going like this," the girl said, her voice trembling. Jake turned to face her, his jaw clenched. He knew she was right. They couldn't keep running forever. But he wasn't going to give up on her. He couldn't. "We don't have a choice," he replied, his voice firm. "We just need to keep moving, and we'll figure it out." The girl nodded, although Jake could see the fear still in her eyes. He could feel it too, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. He glanced around the roof, looking for a way down. They had to get out of the city, find somewhere safe. But every route he considered felt like a dead end. The sound of a car approaching grew louder, and Jake's mind raced. There had to be a way out. "Stay here," he said, pushing the girl to the edge of the roof. "I'll check the other side." He sprinted across the rooftop, scanning for anything that could lead to an escape. The girl stayed behind, watching him anxiously, her eyes darting to the street below. Jake's pulse raced as he reached the other side of the building. There was an old, rusted ladder leading down to a narrow alley below. It wasn't much, but it was something. He turned and waved to the girl. "Over here," he called. The girl moved quickly toward him, her steps steady despite her earlier panic. They had no time to waste. The ladder was old, the rungs rusted and worn, but it was their best shot. Jake climbed down first, his legs shaking with the strain. He waited at the bottom for the girl, his hand outstretched. She descended quickly, her small body nimble as she carefully made her way down the rungs. When she reached the bottom, Jake pulled her into the shadows, pressing himself against the cold brick wall. They stood there for a moment, catching their breath, listening for any sign of the car. The sounds of the engines grew distant, and for a moment, Jake allowed himself to relax. They had bought themselves some time, but not enough. He knew it wouldn't be long before they were back on their trail. "We need to keep moving," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl nodded, her hand clutching his tightly. She didn't speak, but Jake could see the questions in her eyes. Where were they going? What was happening? He didn't have the answers, but he wasn't about to let her down. He pulled her along, moving quickly through the narrow streets, looking for an escape route. He wasn't sure what he was running from anymore, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stop until they were both safe. As they rounded a corner, Jake's eyes locked onto a figure standing in the distance. His heart sank. The last thing he needed right now was more trouble. But it wasn't just any figure. It was someone he recognized. Someone who had been in his life for a long time. And it was the last person he wanted to see right now. Jake's body went rigid as the figure ahead slowly stepped into the dim light of the alley. His heart sank. He recognized the man immediately. It was Tommy, an old acquaintance from his past, someone he had never expected to see again, let alone under these circumstances. Tommy had been a part of the Hells Angels years ago, but something had changed. The man in front of Jake was not the same one he had once known. The light flickered across Tommy's face, revealing the harsh lines and deep shadows that seemed to have aged him far too quickly. His eyes met Jake's, and for a split second, there was no recognition, only an intense wariness, as if Tommy didn't know whether to approach or retreat. "Jake," Tommy said finally, his voice steady but laced with an underlying tension. "I didn't think I'd find you like this." Jake took a deep breath, trying to steady his pulse. He wasn't sure what Tommy was doing here, but he knew this was no coincidence. "What do you want, Tommy?" Jake asked, his voice low. He wasn't about to let this old friend put them in more danger, not when they were so close to losing everything. Tommy glanced down at the girl beside Jake, her small figure hidden in the shadows. His expression softened, and Jake saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. "You've got a kid with you," Tommy murmured, shaking his head. "I didn't expect that." Jake's jaw clenched. The last thing he needed was Tommy judging him. "She's not part of the plan," Jake shot back. "Just tell me what you're doing here." Tommy looked at Jake for a long moment before speaking again. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Jake. But I know what's in that box you're carrying, and I know why they're after you." Jake's stomach dropped. How could Tommy know? What did he know about the box? "What do you mean?" Jake asked, his voice hardening. "Who's after us?" Tommy sighed, rubbing his hand over his face. "The people you've been running from, they don't just want the box, Jake. They want you, and they'll stop at nothing to get both." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He knew Tommy wasn't lying. He had seen the dangers of their world up close, and he knew how far people would go to get what they wanted. But why now? Why hadn't these people come for him sooner? "Why didn't you warn me?" Jake's voice cracked. "I've been trying to stay out of this life for years. And now you show up, telling me this." Tommy's expression softened. "I tried to warn you, Jake. You should have known this was coming. The things you've done, They don't stay buried forever. I was just waiting for the right moment. Jake's mind raced. He was trying to keep it together, but the weight of everything crashing down on him was overwhelming. He had fought so hard to escape his past, to protect the girl from the same dangers he had known. But now, it seemed like that past was coming back to haunt him, dragging the girl into the chaos. What do I do now, Tommy? Jake's voice trembled, the words coming out more broken than he wanted. Tommy didn't hesitate. You need to get her out of here. There's no more running. Not for you, and not for her. You need to confront it head on, Jake. Jake shook his head, the weight of Tommy's words sinking in. He had spent so many years running from the mistakes he'd made. But Tommy was right. He couldn't run anymore. Not with the girl involved. Where do we go? Jake asked, his eyes meeting Tommy's. Tommy looked over at the girl, then back at Jake. There's a safe house. It's off the grid. You won't be able to reach anyone for a while, but it's the only place they won't be able to find you. But it won't be easy. They'll be looking for you. Jake nodded, a sense of resolve settling over him. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep the girl safe, but he was willing to fight for her. He had nothing left to lose. Let's go, Jake said, turning to the girl. She was still standing in the shadows, her eyes wide with fear. She had no idea what was going on, and Jake wasn't sure how much to tell her. But he had to keep her calm. She had trusted him so far, and he wasn't about to let that trust break. He reached out and gently took her hand. We're going to get through this, he said softly. She nodded, her small hand gripping his tightly. As they made their way through the dark alley, Jake couldn't help but feel the weight of the decision he had just made. There was no turning back now. The girl was depending on him. The past was closing in, and Jake knew that if he didn't make the right moves now, everything he had tried to protect would be lost. The streets were empty, the only sound their footsteps echoing off the concrete. Jake felt the tension building again, the danger never far behind. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something else, a flicker of hope. He was done running. And this time, he was going to fight back. Jake led the way, his boots pounding against the pavement as he pulled the girl behind him. The weight of everything, the man from his past, the danger they were in, and the mystery of the box, pressed heavily on his shoulders. He had never been more aware of the stakes, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a spark of resolve. He wasn't going to let this past swallow him. Not again. Not with her involved. As they moved through the shadows of the empty streets, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every step they took was followed by a creeping sense of dread. They couldn't stay in one place for long. They needed to move faster. The girl's hand was still gripped tightly in his, her small fingers cold against his rough skin. He looked over at her. She was trying to keep up, her small legs moving as quickly as they could, but he could see the exhaustion in her face. She had no idea what was happening, and he hated that. He hated the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty she felt. He wished he could tell her it would all be okay, but he knew that wasn't true. Not yet. Not until they got to the safe house. The sound of distant engines reached Jake's ears, and his pulse quickened. He glanced behind him, his gaze scanning the street, but he saw nothing. Just the empty stretch of road, and the faint glow of streetlights flickering in the distance. He wasn't sure if they were being followed yet, but he couldn't take any chances. They had to keep moving. We're almost there, Jake said, his voice low but firm. The girl nodded, her face pale but determined. She trusted him, and that gave him the strength to keep going. He could feel the weight of the box hidden beneath his jacket, pressing against his chest. Whatever was inside, it had to be protected. He couldn't let anyone else get their hands on it. They rounded a corner, and Jake spotted the alley where the safe house was located. It wasn't much, just a rundown building on the edge of town, but it was hidden, and that was all that mattered. He pulled the girl toward the narrow entrance, and quickly checked for any signs of danger. The street was quiet, but the engines he'd heard earlier were still getting closer. They didn't have much time. Stay close, Jake said, his voice tight as he led her inside the building. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to close in around them as they moved further into the darkness. There was no one here. No sounds of footsteps, no signs of life. Just silence. Jake felt a brief sense of relief, but he knew better than to let his guard down. The danger was far from over. He led the girl to a small room in the back of the building, the one that had been set up as a safe spot for emergencies like this. He'd been here before, years ago, when things had gone wrong. The room was simple, with a bed in the corner, a chair, and a small table. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide. He locked the door behind them and turned to the girl, who was looking around the room with wide eyes. "It's not much," Jake said softly, "but it's safe for now." The girl didn't speak, but Jake could see the tension in her posture. She was scared. He could see it in the way her shoulders were hunched, in the way her hands trembled slightly. He wanted to tell her it was over, that they were safe now, but he knew better. It wasn't over. Not yet. They still had the box, and they still had enemies out there, ones who wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted. Jake sat down on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. He had to come up with a plan. He had to keep her safe. He could feel his old instincts kicking in, the ones he had buried so long ago. He had lived a life of violence, of chaos, but now it was different. Now he had someone to protect, someone who mattered more than anything. "We need to rest," Jake said finally, breaking the silence. "We'll stay here for a little while, but we can't stay long. We have to keep moving." The girl nodded silently and sat down on the bed next to him, her small form curled into itself. She didn't say anything, but Jake could feel the weight of her fear. It was a silent bond, one that he couldn't ignore. He had promised to protect her, and that's exactly what he was going to do. The silence stretched on, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Jake's mind kept turning over their next move, but he couldn't think clearly. The girl's presence kept him grounded, but it also reminded him of how much was at stake. As the minutes ticked by, the sound of engines grew louder again, the vibrations shaking the floor beneath them. Jake's heart rate quickened. They weren't safe yet. He stood up quickly, glancing toward the window. There was no way to tell who was out there, but he knew they had to act fast. "We need to go," he said, his voice sharp with urgency. The girl stood up immediately, her small frame tense with fear. Jake could see it in her eyes. She didn't know what was happening, but she trusted him, and that trust was all he needed. He grabbed her hand, and together they moved quickly toward the back door, ready to leave the safe house behind and face whatever was coming for them. Jake pushed open the back door, his eyes scanning the alley outside. The sound of the approaching engines was unmistakable now, the roar of multiple cars coming down the street, and Jake knew they were running out of time. He had hoped for a brief moment of safety, but the danger had caught up with them faster than he anticipated. The girl was close behind him, her small figure moving quickly despite her exhaustion. She didn't ask questions, didn't look around, just followed his lead, trusting him completely. Jake could feel the weight of that trust pressing down on him, reminding him of why he couldn't fail her. The alley was narrow, the buildings on either side towering high above them. Jake moved quickly, pulling the girl along as he checked each corner. There was no time to waste. He could feel the rumble of engines growing louder, closer. He needed to find a way out, a way to get them both to safety. He glanced over at the girl. "Stay close," Jake said, his voice low. She nodded silently, her eyes wide, scanning the darkness around them. She was scared. He could see it in the way she moved, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. But she was also determined. He had to keep that fire alive in her. He had to keep her safe. They reached the end of the alley, but Jake knew they couldn't go any further. The street ahead was wide open, and they'd be exposed if they tried to cross it. He cursed under his breath. The only option was to head back the way they came, but that meant passing by the safe house again, where the car had stopped. If they were still there, they were trapped. Jake's mind raced. He had to think fast. "We can't go this way," Jake muttered to himself, more to reassure himself than the girl. "We have to find another way." He turned, pulling her back toward the alley, but his eyes were still scanning the street, searching for any sign of escape. That's when he saw it. A fire escape ladder leading up to a rooftop. It was the only option. He moved toward it, his hand gripping the girl's tightly. She followed him without hesitation, her small hand gripping his like a lifeline. They reached the ladder, and Jake quickly started climbing, the metal rungs cold against his hands. The girl struggled to keep up, but she was determined. She had no choice. She was in this with him now. Once they reached the top, Jake paused, looking around. From the rooftop, he could see the whole block, the street ahead, the alley behind, and the darkened spaces in between. He had a clear view of the street, and he could see the car parked across the way, its headlights still on. They were still out there. Jake's chest tightened. He had no idea how many people were after them, but he knew it was a lot. He didn't have the luxury of guessing. They were on borrowed time. "We need to move fast," Jake said, his voice low and urgent. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her to the edge of the roof. The next building was only a few feet away, but it was still a jump. He didn't have time to check the distance. He didn't have time to think. The car would be here any second. "Hold on to me," Jake said. She looked up at him, her face pale but determined. "Okay," she whispered, squeezing his hand. They took a deep breath, and Jake jumped first, landing with a soft thud on the next roof. He turned quickly, holding out his hand to the girl. She followed without hesitation, her feet finding the same rhythm as his. As soon as she landed, they moved quickly, staying close to the edge of the building, using the shadows to stay hidden. Jake's heart raced as they moved, his mind constantly checking over their shoulders. He was used to running, used to being on the move, but this was different. He wasn't just running for his own life anymore. He was running for hers. They reached the next rooftop, and Jake paused, listening. The cars were getting closer, but they hadn't reached the building yet. He knew they had a few moments before they were exposed. But the tension in his chest told him that those moments were precious. He looked over at the girl, who was now breathing heavily, her small face etched with exhaustion and fear. He couldn't let her down. He wouldn't. "We're almost there," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. She nodded, her eyes still wide, still searching. He knew the fear hadn't left her, but he also knew she trusted him. That trust was their only hope right now. They moved again, ducking low as they crossed the roof to the next building. As they climbed down to the fire escape, Jake's thoughts raced. The safe house was close, but he wasn't sure how long they had before the people after them found it. He had no choice. He had to take a risk. They couldn't stay on the rooftops forever. He was still holding her hand tightly as they made their way down the escape ladder, both of them moving quickly, but carefully. They hit the ground, their feet hitting the concrete as they ducked into the shadows. The alley was clear, but the sound of the car engines was still close. Jake's instincts were on fire, his mind running through the next steps. He wasn't about to let them get caught. Not now. Not with everything they had been through. "Keep going," Jake whispered to the girl, pulling her along, his heart racing. "We're almost there." Jake's breath came in shallow, quick gasps as he and the girl made their way through the alley, moving as fast as they could without drawing attention. The tension in the air was thick, and every sound seemed to echo louder than it should. The engines had grown quieter, but Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they were back on their tail. He glanced over at the girl, her small figure still close behind him. Her grip on his hand was strong, but he could feel her fear in the way her fingers trembled. She was scared, and he hated it. She shouldn't have to be in this situation. She shouldn't have to be running for her life. Jake's heart ached for her, but he couldn't let that distract him. Not now. He had to keep moving. "Keep up," he whispered, looking over his shoulder. She nodded, her eyes wide but determined. She wasn't giving up. Neither was he. They rounded another corner, heading deeper into the maze of alleys, trying to stay ahead of whoever was chasing them. The buildings around them were tall and looming, the shadows stretching across the streets as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. It was getting darker, and that meant less visibility, which was both good and bad. Good, because they could blend into the shadows more easily. Bad, because it also meant the people after them could be even closer than they realized. "We need to find a way out of here," Jake muttered to himself, his mind racing. They couldn't keep running forever. He had no idea where they were going, no clear plan, just the hope that they could stay ahead long enough to figure it out. They reached the end of the alley and stopped, crouching behind a dumpster. Jake's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing, but the sound of tires on wet asphalt told him they weren't far away. "They're getting closer," Jake said, his voice low. The girl looked up at him, her face pale, but her eyes still full of trust. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see that she was waiting for him to figure it out. He had to. "I'm sorry," Jake whispered, more to himself than to her. "I'm not going to let them get you." He had made a promise to her, and he was going to keep it, no matter what. They couldn't stay here long. Jake knew they needed a place to hide, something more secure than the alley. But where? Where could they go that would keep them safe? His thoughts were interrupted by the screeching sound of a car skidding around the corner, its headlights cutting through the dark like a spotlight. Jake's heart stopped. They had found them. The car slowed as it turned into the alley, its headlights sweeping the area. Jake pressed himself and the girl further into the shadows, holding his breath. He could feel the heat of the engine, the rush of the tires on the wet pavement. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. The car came to a stop right in front of the dumpster they were hiding behind. Jake's pulse raced. He didn't know what to do. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. He had to make a choice, and it had to be fast. The sound of a door opening broke the silence. A figure stepped out, tall and imposing, wearing a leather jacket that was unmistakable. Jake's eyes widened. He knew this man. It was one of the people from his past, someone he hadn't seen in years. Someone who shouldn't be here. Jake, the man said, his voice cold and familiar. We've been looking for you. Jake's muscles tensed, every instinct telling him to act, to run, to fight. But the girl's hand, still in his, reminded him that he couldn't just go rushing into this. He had to be smart. He had to think. The man took a step forward, his eyes scanning the alley, and then his gaze locked onto Jake. It's over, Jake, the man said, his voice dripping with a dark certainty. You can't outrun your past forever. You know that. Jake's stomach dropped. He had been trying to outrun this very moment for years. The man's words stung, but they weren't entirely true. Jake had changed. He wasn't the same person he used to be. He had someone to protect now. Someone he couldn't let down. I'm not who I was, Jake said, his voice steady but filled with determination. The man chuckled, the sound low and dangerous. No, you're not, he said, his eyes narrowing. But that doesn't change anything. We're taking you in, Jake. And this time, there's no escape. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts flashing back to the times he had barely escaped from situations just like this. But he wasn't going to make the same mistake again. He couldn't. He wasn't running anymore. Not with the girl in danger. You don't get to make the rules anymore, Jake said, his voice low and firm. I'm not going with you. The man took a step closer, but Jake didn't move. He wasn't going to let fear take over. He wasn't going to let the past drag him back into the darkness. This was his fight now, and he was going to win it. The man raised his hands, signaling to the car behind him. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he prepared for whatever was coming next. But just as the man took another step forward, something unexpected happened. The sound of another engine revved in the distance, growing louder by the second. A car. No, not just a car, a group of them. The man froze. Jake's mind raced. The cavalry was coming. But whose side were they on? The sound of engines grew louder, closer now, and Jake's instincts kicked into overdrive. His pulse quickened as he turned toward the noise, his heart sinking with each passing second. The man in front of him, the one from his past, was still standing there, smirking like he had all the time in the world. But Jake knew better. He had to act, and fast. He couldn't let the girl see the fear that was creeping up his spine. He couldn't show weakness, not now. As the sound of the engines roared louder, Jake's mind raced. Who were these new players? Were they coming to help? Or were they here to finish what the others had started? There was no way to know, and time was running out. He glanced over at the girl, still clutching his hand. She was trembling, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Jake's heart twisted. He wasn't going to let her get caught up in this. He couldn't. Stay close, Jake murmured to her, his voice low and urgent. She nodded silently, her grip tightening around his hand. Jake could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He had never been in a position like this before. The people chasing them weren't just random thugs. They were part of his past, people who knew him too well. The man in front of him had been one of his old associates, someone who knew every dark secret Jake had buried. And now that past had caught up with him. But what about the new cars? Jake didn't have time to worry about them. The man was still standing there, his eyes fixed on Jake like he was the target. You've got nowhere to run, the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. You think you can escape all of this? You think you can just walk away from the Hell's Angels, from everything you've done? Jake's jaw clenched. He was done with the past. But there was no escaping it now. I'm not running, Jake said, his voice steady but cold. And I'm not going with you. The man stepped closer, his expression darkening. You think you have a choice? You think you can just walk away from the club, from all the blood you've spilled? You think you're a hero for some little girl? Jake's blood ran cold. The words hit him harder than he cared to admit. But there was no time for guilt. He wasn't going to let anyone hurt the girl. Not him, not anyone. The engines outside were almost on top of them now, and Jake knew they couldn't stay here much longer. The man moved closer, his hand reaching for something hidden beneath his jacket. Jake's senses were on high alert. He didn't know what the man was carrying, but he knew it couldn't be good. With a flash of movement, Jake reached for his gun, pulling it from the holster and aiming it straight at the man. The man froze, his eyes widening. "You don't have to do this," the man said, his voice losing its earlier bravado. "You're not going to shoot me, Jake. You're not that guy anymore." Jake's hand shook slightly, but his resolve was firm. He had no intention of going back to the life he had left behind. He had no intention of being dragged back into this world of violence, of pain. But the girl, she was counting on him. She had to be safe. The engines outside stopped, the sudden silence filling the air like a pressure in his chest. Jake's eyes flicked to the girl. She was still standing there, her wide eyes locked on him. But she wasn't making a sound. He had to protect her. He had to get her out of here. But the man was still standing in his way. Jake's grip tightened on the gun. "Get out of my way," he said, his voice low and commanding. The man hesitated for a moment, but then stepped aside, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is over?" he spat. "You think you're going to walk away from everything you've done? You think you can just leave the club and forget about all the blood on your hands?" Jake didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. He turned toward the alley, pulling the girl with him. The man didn't follow, but Jake could feel his eyes on his back, the weight of his presence still hanging in the air. They had to move. They couldn't stop. Not yet. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as they made their way through the alley, moving quickly but cautiously. The sounds of the engines had faded, but Jake knew they weren't in the clear. They weren't safe yet. He glanced behind him, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. But the street was still. Too still. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. They turned another corner, and Jake spotted the abandoned warehouse in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was hidden. It was the best place they could go. But as they got closer, Jake's stomach dropped. There was something off about it. The door was slightly ajar, and he could hear voices. The sound of someone moving inside. He stopped, his hand on the girl's shoulder, and pulled her behind him, hiding in the shadows. His mind raced. He couldn't let them be found here. Not now. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but his heart was racing. He had no idea who was inside, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. They weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. Jake stood still in the shadows, his breath held tight in his chest as he listened carefully to the faint sounds coming from inside the warehouse. He couldn't see anyone through the cracked door, but he could hear muffled voices and the soft shuffle of footsteps. The girl clung to his side, her wide eyes filled with uncertainty. Jake could feel her fear, but he also knew she was strong. She had been through so much already, and somehow, she trusted him to get them both out of this. But as much as he wanted to reassure her, the truth was, he didn't know if he could keep that promise. They weren't safe yet. The man they had encountered earlier was still out there, and Jake knew that whatever was happening in that warehouse could lead to more danger. He had to be smart about this. There was no room for mistakes. "Stay here," Jake whispered to the girl, his voice low and steady. He couldn't risk her being seen, not when they were so close to finding safety. She nodded silently, her small figure shrinking back into the shadows. Jake moved cautiously toward the door, keeping low to the ground. His heart beat loudly in his chest, but his mind was focused. He had been through countless situations like this before, but never with so much at stake. He couldn't let the girl down. He couldn't let the past take over again. He peeked through the crack in the door, squinting into the dim interior of the warehouse. There were 3 men inside, all sitting around a table with a map spread out in front of them. The low murmur of their conversation reached Jake's ears, but the words were too faint to make out. His fingers curled around the handle of his gun, the cold metal reassuring against his palm. He needed to know what they were up to. He had to be ready for whatever came next. After a moment, Jake stepped back from the door, his mind working quickly. He couldn't just barge in. He needed to find out what they were planning, but he also needed to protect the girl. He couldn't risk getting caught. He glanced back at her, still hidden in the shadows, her face pale with fear. She was waiting for him, and he wasn't going to let anyone hurt her. Jake took a deep breath and stepped into the warehouse, moving silently along the edges of the building. The men hadn't noticed him yet, and he kept to the shadows, staying out of sight. He crept closer, trying to catch snippets of their conversation. He couldn't make out everything, But there was one thing he did hear clearly. We need to find them. They won't get away this time. Jake's stomach twisted. They were talking about him. They knew they were close, and they weren't going to stop until they found him. He had to act fast. He moved around the back of the warehouse, looking for another way out. He couldn't risk staying here too long. He was getting closer to the point of no return. He had to protect the girl. He had to get them both out. As he moved toward the back of the building, he saw a door, half hidden behind a stack of old crates. It looked like it led outside, and it was their best shot at making an escape. He moved toward it, his heart racing. Just as he reached for the door, a loud crash echoed from inside the warehouse. Jake froze. He didn't have to turn around to know that they had spotted him. The voices inside had risen, urgent and demanding. The game was up. Jake turned and ran, his feet pounding against the concrete floor as he headed back toward the front of the building. The girl was waiting for him, her small figure barely visible in the shadows. He could hear the men following behind him, their heavy footsteps getting closer. He had to reach her, had to get them both out before it was too late. He reached her just as the first man rounded the corner of the building. Without thinking, Jake grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the fire escape ladder. "Climb," he said urgently, his voice low but filled with fear. The girl nodded, her fear giving way to instinct. She scrambled up the ladder, and Jake followed closely behind, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. As they reached the top, Jake heard the sound of a car engine roaring to life below them. The sound of tires screeching echoed in the air. They were running out of time. The men were closing in fast. Jake grabbed the girl's hand again, pulling her toward the far side of the building. He didn't know where they were going yet, but he knew they couldn't stay here. The sound of engines grew louder, and Jake's heart hammered in his chest. They had to get out. They had to disappear. But as they rounded the corner of the roof, Jake saw something that made his blood run cold. Another group of men stood in the distance, blocking the way. He didn't recognize them, but they were just as dangerous. His heart skipped a beat. They were trapped. There was no way out. Jake looked at the girl, her face full of fear and confusion. She didn't understand what was happening, but she was depending on him. He couldn't let her down. He couldn't let them win. As the sound of footsteps grew louder, Jake's mind raced. There was only one thing left to do. Fight. Jake stood frozen, his eyes locked on the men blocking the far end of the roof. There was no way around them, no easy escape. The girl was still behind him, her small hands gripping his jacket, her face filled with confusion and fear. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the men moved closer, their footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. The wind howled through the empty spaces between the buildings, carrying with it the distant sound of the cars that had been following them. The walls of the city felt like they were closing in. He couldn't let them catch him, not after everything he had fought for, not with the girl depending on him. He wasn't going to let her down. He turned to her, his voice low but filled with urgency. "Stay behind me. Whatever happens, stay close." She nodded, her wide eyes never leaving him. He could see the trust in them, and it cut through him like a knife. It wasn't just his life at stake anymore. It was hers. The men were getting closer now, their shadows stretching across the rooftop as they moved toward Jake and the girl. They weren't going to give up. This was the endgame, and Jake knew it. He had spent his entire life running, fighting, trying to escape the past, but now it was all catching up to him. The girl was in danger because of him. He wasn't going to let it happen. He couldn't. Jake turned back to face the men. The lead one, the one with the cold eyes and the cruel smirk, stepped forward. "You really thought you could escape, didn't you, Jake?" he sneered. Jake didn't answer. His hand tightened around the gun in his holster, but he knew it wouldn't be enough. There were too many of them. But there was one thing they didn't know. Jake wasn't alone anymore. The sound of a motorcycle engine roared through the night, growing louder by the second. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know who it was, but he could only hope that it was someone on his side. The men hesitated, looking toward the sound of the engine as it grew louder. "What the hell is that?" one of them muttered. Jake took advantage of their distraction. He reached for the girl, pulling her toward the edge of the building. "Now," he shouted. They ran, the sound of footsteps pounding behind them as they neared the edge. Jake's eyes locked onto the fire escape ladder just a few feet away. They could make it. The motorcycle engine was getting closer. The men were still hesitating, unsure of what was happening, and Jake wasn't about to waste this opportunity. "Stay close," Jake said, urging the girl to climb faster. They reached the fire escape, and Jake climbed first, pulling the girl up behind him. The engine roared louder, and Jake didn't look back. They were almost there. He had to keep moving. When they reached the top of the fire escape, Jake stopped for a moment to catch his breath. The sound of the motorcycle was right behind them now. He turned, looking for a way out. He could see the silhouette of a rider speeding down the street below, heading straight toward the rooftop. Jake didn't have time to think. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her to the edge of the building again. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let them get caught. Not now. Not when they were so close. The motorcycle skidded to a stop at the base of the building, the rider leaping off and sprinting toward them. Jake's heart was racing. Who was this? Was it a friend or an enemy? The rider reached them, his face hidden by a helmet, but his eyes were locked on Jake's. He held up his hand, signaling for them to stop. "You're not alone," the rider said, his voice muffled by the helmet but unmistakable. Jake froze. The man wasn't one of the men who had been chasing them, but Jake knew the voice. It was a voice from his past, a voice he never thought he would hear again. The man pulled off his helmet, revealing a face Jake hadn't seen in years. "You didn't think you'd get away that easily, did you?" the man said, his voice full of dark humor. Jake's stomach twisted. He recognized him immediately, one of the brothers from his old motorcycle club, a man who had once been a close friend. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. The man smiled, a wicked grin that sent a chill down Jake's spine. "Saving your ass," he said, before looking at the girl. "And hers." Jake didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. The man had helped him, but he had been part of the club, part of the same darkness Jake had been trying to escape. He wasn't sure what his motives were, but right now, he didn't have time to question it. He needed answers, and he needed them fast. "We need to get out of here," Jake said, his voice urgent. The man nodded. "Follow me." Without another word, he turned and led them to a nearby alley, disappearing into the shadows. Jake didn't hesitate. He followed the man, pulling the girl along behind him. He didn't know where this was going, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let his past control his future. Not now. Not ever again. I've got a thrilling new chapter for all fans of Hell Angel stories, packed with intense action, suspense, and unexpected twists. In this gripping journey, Jake, a former member of the Hell Angels, is faced with the haunting echoes of his past as he tries to protect a young girl who has unknowingly become a target. The action builds as Jake runs from his dangerous history, trying to keep the girl safe, all while navigating betrayal and conflict. But in these Hell Angel stories, nothing is ever as it seems. As Jake faces familiar enemies, including members from his old club, he finds himself at a crossroads, unsure of who to trust. But when allies from his past unexpectedly return, Jake is forced to make difficult decisions that will determine both his and the girl's fate. With each passing moment, the stakes rise and the danger feels closer. These Hell Angel stories show the true meaning of loyalty, sacrifice, and redemption, as Jake fights to rewrite his past and protect the future he's trying to build. Will Jake's fight for redemption be enough to escape the shadows of his former life? Or will the past catch up with him and destroy everything he's trying to protect? These stories have all the drama, action, and unexpected moments you crave, and it's not over yet. Tune in to find out what happens next in this thrilling saga of survival and redemption in the world of Hell Angel stories.